Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, on top of being armchair geostrategists, we are now armchair virologists because we are going to discuss the much anticipated Wuhan virus. And I hear it targets only interracial couples. No, that I'm sorry, the Wuhan virus. Wuhan virus, something else. Don't worry, no branches will be broken today. But uh, it looks pretty serious. Now, as I said, we're pretty much armchairing this, but I want to discuss more of the implications with the shutting down travel and some of the restrictions that have been put in place rather than the actual virus. But I do have a little bit of conspiracy theory I'll close the segment out with. But for now, we have the virus that originated in China near a science academy that studied viruses and biological weapons, which, again, I'll touch on that later. But so far, North Korea was the first to cancel and suspend travel with China to prevent the spread of the disease. Russia recently closed their land border. Several European countries have suspended flights to and from China, Italy being the most recent one. Israel has suspended flights to and from China. The United States, the government hasn't officially. Of course, Trump is monitoring the situation. I've seen some reports that he's said he's not going to, but again, something like this can always be revisited. But several private airlines are saying we're not flying to China anymore. State departments put out travel warnings saying stay out unless you have a legitimate reason to go to China. And there's several air workers unions suing airline companies as well as like shipping companies and cruise companies suing, saying no, we're not going to go to China. This is too much of a health risk. So it looks like they're finally starting to respond to the situation and shut down travel. Now, a lot of people do have a very understandable concern about this. Even I did at some point. I'm not saying I don't at this point. But from what I know about the disease, so far it has infected more people than the SARS outbreak in a much shorter period of time. But most of the deaths have been people who are of advanced age, like 60, 65 plus. Older people, people with a otherwise compromised immune system. So maybe if it gets to San Francisco, we'll have some problems. But aside from that, but in all seriousness, one other thing we also have to consider is China is by no means a third world country, but the standard of living is much lower than it is in the West, especially in Wuhan, like that central southern China region. It's not exactly Beijing or Shanghai, which have completely shut down out of public health concerns. But point being is, a lot of this, I think, probably has to boil down to less sanitary conditions, lower standard of living, less quality health care, and ultimately people, especially in that part of China, now by no means is Wuhan rural, but the parts around that southern China area is more rural. People may think, oh, it's just a cough, just a cold, just a flu, I'll get over this in a couple days, and that could ultimately be their demise. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying how severe it is. Of course, the World Health Organization has declared it an international emergency, but that doesn't mean like it's the global world-ending pandemic that a lot of people would think it is. I mean, understandably so. But point being is, we won't know how serious this is until it breaks out in a Western first world country. And so far, there's been cases in South Korea and Japan and the United States, but these are people who went to China or are of Chinese expats, or for example, Chinese American citizens going to and from the city. So far, I'm pretty sure that's all the cases in the United States. The one case in Germany was a German who was in China who infected one of his other family members. Um, we've evacuated any American citizens we've had there, whether they be working on diplomatic mission or working with Chinese companies or some other private enterprise in that country. So it looks like they finally started to respond. I would have preferred a response sooner. Better safe than sorry. But I don't think we've gotten to the world-ending plague epidemic outbreak. I don't even think we've gotten to Spanish flu level where it kills a lot of people, but ultimately is very survivable. What it looks like to me so far, again, I'm no medical expert here, is that it's infecting a lot of old Chinese people with access to substandard healthcare compared to Western healthcare.
Yeah, that seems to be it. We only know of one teenager who has mysteriously died. I looked into it. I haven't found an article as to why, a teenager has died from it. But of the 170 so who have died, yeah, like you say, most of them are elderly or uh, 60 and older. So, that said, I mean, the world is an older population now than it was 50 years ago. So you can understand maybe if, why some people are more panicked than others. Um, it's done now. Interestingly enough, of course, there's flights originating from a military base south of Lisbon in Portugal, and it is going to be tasked with removing people of European citizenship out of China as well as Russia. Russia itself has closed its border with China. Currently, there is only one way to go from Moscow to Beijing, and it is with only one train. Hong Kong and China have closed their borders.
Same with
I guess,
Macau, which is the other semi-independent Chinese city.
yeah,
Sort of like the
I guess
Portuguese
Trump
Hong
won.
Kong, but yeah, yeah, but uh,
Bluff did it.
he did it. He did it.
He did it. Who's laughing now?
This is all distraction from impeachment. Okay, we released a biological contaminant to the Chinese population. Distract. No, Putin released a biological contaminant to the Chinese population, betraying his allies, much like Hitler, mind you, to detract from his puppet in Washington being impeached. That's what actually happened. Come to the war report for
That's
the hottest
right.
takes.
That's right. He will never let go of Trump. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how long this lasts. From the looks of it, yes, I think it's more serious than SARS, but this is not like some of the real pandemics that we've had where millions have died. Um, the World Health Organization has said that they expect, well, okay, so there's different estimates. One is they expect a vaccine before the end of 2020. However, there's been other sources who've said that in their particular country, their health service will be able to come up with a vaccine by summer. So I think this is it seems fairly well contained. Um, People can mull over the effects that this has on on the social aspect of life and so on, and you know however that may feed into statecraft and whatnot. But um, I don't see any major changes. I think by the end of February, this should be fairly well contained. I've listened to some other podcasts that are claiming this will never be fixed because China is unable to just shut down the whole country, despite the fact that 50 million or so are, in some kind of quarantine or another.
Yeah, you can say many,
Uh,
many things about the Chinese government, but one thing you cannot say about them is that they do not rule their population with an iron fist and can shut it down at their will. I mean, come on, this is communist China we're talking about. This is the People's Republic of China. They are known for their heavy-handed rule, for better and for worse. In this case, it
yeah,
might be for better, as wrong as that's going to sound, as out of context that's going to be taken by some people.
yeah. Normies won't understand this. There's no libertarianism isn't going to thrive in a situation like this. you know, you're going to be quarantined, okay? um, uh, and they'll probably give them whatever equivalent of the flu shot, but for coronavirus. Yeah, and I think actually most people probably like there has been some dissent. There was a doctor who did criticize the government mostly for not acting appropriately. He went on to say, but this communist government, which loves slogans, which is a fairly you know defamatory and it's quite insulting. I mean, I say this only because it's surprising that that you would see something or hear something like this. I actually saw the video of it. So we'll see. I think it's still pretty early. It's only been about a week. So the real tragedy may be how many people won't have access to, say, food for prolonged periods of time, depending on how things go. Um, but there's certain citizens from Western backgrounds, even with their families, are now being able to fly out. They're going to be quarantined as well for at least 14 days to see if the virus is spread or not. But other than that, I don't have really anything more to add on top of what you have already said.
Now, just to get to our 15-minute mark, I have a little bit of a rabbit hole I went down today. So, when I first saw this, I thought it was a satire article, but apparently Romanians have developed a treatment for what they call a vaccine. There's a team of Romanian doctors, I've heard varying accounts based on different translations, that only works for Caucasian populations. And no, I'm not saying this is a joke, I'm not saying this is a meme, but it turns out the way this is because of the difference in immune systems and the difference between pretty much white people and Asians, that this virus affects Asians more and treatment is easier for white populations. Now, the Romanian government said so far they've developed it. It can't be mass produced because of the expense of it. Now, granted, they're in talks with German medical professionals because, of course, Romania is going to be a lot harder to manufacture a life saving drug, as it were, than it would be for a country like Germany or France or the UK or the US. But point being, okay, this is Romania, this is a European country within the Western sphere, so any information they have, they're probably going to pass it along, especially considering the fact that they're one of these statelets. They're pretty much subjected to foreign powers, and it might be the off chance they give it to Russia, but I don't foresee that. But point being is, there's also now this will all tie back together when I finish this. There's also theories running around that this is a biological weapon gone loose. Now, there's some reports that this specific virus had been patented in either the United States or Canada, possibly a joint project, that was stolen by the Chinese. Of course, China, one thing they're very skilled at is industrial and sort of the corporate espionage, stealing the ideas rather than actual political spying. But so that's reasonable, and considering the fact this plague outbreak happened at a food market 8 miles away from a science academy where they research viruses and biological weapons. If you allow me to put on my tinfoil hat, I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm not saying this is something I believe in, but something worth entertaining, and at least something, an interesting line of thought. So, the West develops a biological weapon that specifically targets Asians. Okay, this is during the Cold War. That would be a very real possibility, especially, Vietnam just ended. Thinking ahead to a future war in Southeast Asia, maybe with China proper, maybe in Korea. So they're developing WMDs. They developed this specific WMD, a biological weapon that would disproportionately target people of East Asian descent. China catches wind of this, they steal it, they try to reverse engineer it, but either some crazy disgruntled scientist, or what's more likely, a security breach, results in this getting out into the general Chinese population, which has infected several thousands of people at this point. I believe 9,000 is the most recent total, with around 180 to 200 deaths, are the most recent numbers I've seen. So, going down this conspiracy theory line, for all we know, this could be a biological weapon targeted specifically towards Asians, and that's why it's easier to cure in European populations. I don't know about black populations or any other parts, just mainly people of European descent and Asian descent. And yeah, for all we know, this could be something they developed specifically as a bioweapon, and that's why the cure, or quote unquote cure, has been more effective on Europeans.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. It's possible. We live in a time that it's very difficult to judge who to believe. Especially, I would say since Kennedy's assassination. I'm not saying one way or the other about Kennedy, but I think depending on the day, like, and depending on whatever conspiracy or whoever the conspirators are, it's like I would say 50% of the population or more is doesn't believe the official line. I don't know. I don't like some of this doesn't make sense. It could also be um, because you could argue that if this is something that has happened, wouldn't Chinese be more immune to it? Because I mean, if we go with the official story that this happened in a food market, and it could have come from one of the animals. Uh, I'm not. I'll try not to say bat.
Yeah. I mean,
But
these people develop immunities
you
to
would
things
think
they've
that
eaten for.
they've created an immune to, because a lot of other populations, of course, have. All you have to do is, for instance, milk. Uh, uh, there's populations, of course, that are allergic. Well, allergic to milk. They have lactose intolerance. So uh, you would think that Chinese people have lived and uh, had diets such as these for quite some time. That generally they'd be more immune to something like this. Anyhow, I just thought that deserves mention.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that actually goes to the point where, yeah, it may have been a Western manufactured bioweapon at that point. Now, I'm not saying I buy into that, but one thing we do know for sure is that for whatever reason, whether it was engineered that way or whether just by a freak of nature sort of accident, it has a worse effect on people of East Asian descent than it does on people of European descent. That's my final word for it, and there's definitely reason to be concerned. And I'm honestly, this also raised the point. I can't remember who I was listening to, but they made the point that think about all the travel we have going back and forth to India. Well, in India, they're having a tuberculosis outbreak. Now, this isn't the tuberculosis of old. It's, of course, evolved and adapted over time. So, I wouldn't say I'm more concerned about it, but I would say there's an equal reason to be concerned about our HB1 visa workers bringing over a new strain of tuberculosis as there is about this Wuhan virus. But I mean, I think it just goes to show some of the pitfalls of globalization and mass travel with how few restrictions we have. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this for me is that, maybe, okay, I don't oppose, I think one of the few good things about the modern world is that you can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours. But I think what this shows is we definitely need a lot more safety precautions. Now, people realize this with terrorism, they realize this with foreign threats. But it seems just now it takes a scare like this for them to realize this about outbreaks, health issues.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's literally one of the first things I thought of was the how human beings and their immune systems have evolved for a very long time from a very particular place where they've lived. Uh, it's obviously it comes from a certain amount of sedentary life. Of course, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have civilization either. So yeah, uh, there's no civilization without farming and without some kind of sedentary life.
Yeah, but I again, I don't think this is the doomsday virus, and I don't know if that's going to be what wipes us out. But that's conversation for a different day. But what I think this is a wake up call that if we don't find a way to quickly like have an off switch on this globalization, which I don't think we can develop a foolproof one that completely shuts down global trade and travel overnight, but if we don't find a more efficient way to, if a big one actually does hit, if another Spanish flu or bubonic plague actually does hit, then it's going to be nasty.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
But that's my main takeaway from from the Wuhan virus. Not to be confused with the Wuhan virus, which you start making those jokes enough, you actually do mixed up in your speech. I've called the Wuhan virus a couple times. People who don't know what that is have given me blank stares. So, but that's aside the point. But getting into some more cheery news, Brexit actually happened. I know what you're thinking. You're in disbelief. It's been 3.5 years, just over, and Farage gave his farewell speech, which I can't play due to technological restrictions and the fact that YouTube is kind of prickly about these things. Though they're liable to take you down for 2 seconds of what could be anything that could be construed as copyrighted material. But it was very jolly on his part. It was very gloatish. Even though my favorite part at the end is when he put out the little British flags near his country's delegation thing, and like the chair of the committee was saying, "Take those flags down. You're not allowed to have those." And he was just leaving them up. He's like, "What do you care? We're leaving anyway." So it was very defiant. And despite our sort of pessimistic take on Brexit at this point, with how much it's just become a symbolic gesture rather than actual British sovereignty, it's still nice to see the impotence of the EU on display with someone like Farage standing up there and just thrashing them in what ultimately amounts to a farewell speech. And now, I believe, even though it's gone through the parliament, that the deal officially takes effect tomorrow. But point being is, there's no room to back out. This isn't like the other times where they back out last minute. No, it's been confirmed by the British Parliament. I believe it's been confirmed by the European Union authorities. But I believe by the time you hear the show, the UK will no longer be a member state of the European Union.
Yeah, I didn't think I'd have so many. I agree with you. Maybe that's the most important takeaway of all this is that um, ultimately it isn't. It shows the weakness of the EU. Um, However, I can't help but think, Boris Johnson's words this week about he seemed quite happy to know that with Brexit it will be even faster and easier to have uh, uh, immigrants or work migrants from Africa. So I don't know. Um, it, it, that was that was let's just be honest. That was a betrayal of why many of the people who voted to leave voted for it at all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, at this point, it's more of a symbolic gesture of the weakness of the European Union. And like I said, at this point, the UK has forced themselves into where if they could have done this even as late as 2018, they could have been a secondary power in this world with their Commonwealth, with these other countries they have diplomatic relations with. But now they've wedged themselves into becoming a sideshow partner of the EU, if Macron will allow it, or part of the broader American sphere. And I think the latter is more likely in that case, especially with Trump and Boris Johnson, sort of these I don't want to call them faux populists, but I guess semi-populist figures where there'll be sort of unity. Now, probably Australia and reluctantly Canada will be on board. Like I said, I think we're starting to see an Anglosphere bloc more cohesively formed. Not that it hasn't existed before, but I think it's become more cohesive and more distinct from continental Europe. And like I said, ultimately, I think this is a good thing, but it's kind of hard to be happy about with how much they've lost along the way. No, I'm not saying that it's would have been better for them to stay. Funny enough, I think the EU might be able to go in a better direction without the British influence. Someone like, as much as I may dislike him, a Macron can make those inroads with Russia. He's more tolerant of the populist bloc, um, and not be even beyond France. But I think Russia, because the biggest voice against Russia in the EU wasn't the Poles, wasn't any of these Eastern European countries. It was the British, funny enough. So we may see that door open now that the British is out, and ultimately I think this will be better for continental Europe and a quote unquote hijacking of the EU by more right wing illiberal forces rather than a dissolution of it. Which I'm not saying either way they should go. I'm no policy expert on this. I think it's one of those things that's play by ear. But point being is, I think we're ultimately in a better world for it on both sides. But again, there's that feeling of pessimism that it took so long, and it feels like a Pyrrhic victory from at least a British point of view, and ultimately a anti-globalist point of view. The fact that this superstate was able to browbeat this country and make an example out of them, to the point where if any of these other countries want to leave, they're going to look at Brexit and look at how long and hard fought of a process it was. Whereas if it would have been rapid, it would have blown a massive deal of credibility to the UK, to the EU. But at this point, it blew, I would say, a moderate amount of the EU's credibility. But again, they were able to get those final shows of force on their former colony, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. We'll see how it goes. It will be interesting to see what the average Brexiter is going to react to, to this. It would be kind of ironic if they lose interest in it, and that the new Britain is it doesn't end up solving anything that it hoped it would have through Brexit. So yeah, we shall see.
Now, what I can say for the most positive note is I don't foresee a UK re-entry into the UK, not because I don't put it past the liberal-minded people in the UK to push for integration or Scotland to try to break way for integration, but I think where we stand now, the European leadership, especially somebody like a Macron, doesn't want the British in there. They view them as more of an anchor around their neck in that point, as I was saying with their broader plans, with Macron sort of turning the EU into his state, as we've seen. And it was before, I would say, Germany and Merkel's, and Merkel was pretty complicit with the will of the United States, at least up until recently. Some of these deals they've been making with Russia have been pretty interesting, but Macron, again, like I said, I hate to keep on praising the man, but he's a firebrand. And if he can throw around the weight of the EU, I think the UK was a stumbling block to that. And I think a lot of his goals are now a lot more feasible. What direction he wants to take the EU in
Right.
on a geopolitical level, not even just like a inter-union level, but the union's reaction with the other world powers. I think that becomes a lot more feasible with the British out of the picture, especially with someone like Boris Johnson in office. Now, Johnson, he has his good sides, has his bad sides. I'm pretty mixed on the guy, but especially his view on global politics. Very Anglo-American, very much wants to preserve that Cold War order, very anti-Russia. So this may also be a victory for the European Union in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It does seem I think it's a long way off to see if any of those developments how they will work for the EU. I say that because I think it's still very early. Obviously, Britain not being in the EU is an enormous loss for the EU. So, what will the EU have to do to stay afloat? Obviously, Britain is going to become even closer and more entangled with the American economy, American foreign policy. America will rely on Britain, really, basically, to keep an eye on Europe, as Britain once did in the last century, and in the century more so previously. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not going to go this far, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're definitely going to see a comprehensive free trade agreement with the U.S. and the U.K. Probably throwing Canada, and Australia, and other Anglosphere countries in there for good measure. We're going to see even more increased military cooperation because Brexit does not mean the British exit from NATO. Keep that in mind. They're still linked to a lot of these
Mhm.
continental European countries through NATO, through military alliances. So it's not a complete divorce
Right.
from Europe.
Right, right. Very much so. Very much so. If anything, this will also this will have an effect on NATO eventually
It'll have
because
to.
of it'll have to. There's no way around it.
I mean,
Um, I
with
mean, we're America's already. I mean, of course, the amount of sanctions that America has imposed on other NATO countries for working with Russia. Um, this breakup could actually suit America extremely well
yes,
because now
absolutely.
the EU will not have the kind of power, the kind of influence. Not that it was all that great before, but it will certainly be diminished. In which case, France ultimately will have to make a certain kind of decision that both, uh, let's say, I mean, we always talk about, Hungary and Poland and Italy and Slovakia. What will it do? You can see Macron is already preparing for such a world. Uh, but how successful is it going to be? Just to bring up Nord Stream 2, which is it's a very important development. Now, 96% or 94% of Nord Stream 2 is complete. America threatened sanctions on all of the companies that were involved in building it. Um, so the Russians are going to use their military to lay down the last 5-6% of the pipes. And once it opens, what's going to happen? Will Germany and France be able to stand up and weather the sanctions that America will put on? I mean, to be really, we should recognize that Russia and America are at war at the moment. They are at war. It's not like a war from the 20th or the 19th century, but they are at war.
Again, it goes back to it's a fourth generation war. They're fighting it in
Yeah.
Syria, they're fighting it all across the world, and it's also become an economic war, especially in Europe, with natural gas, with these pipelines. And you bring up a good point, as I was saying, you're going to see further military integration of the U.S. and U.K. even beyond NATO, and probably more the Anglosphere in general, as I mentioned. But you're going to see also continental Europe with these with France and Germany moving towards Russia, maybe even bearing some of the U.S. sanctions for the benefit of cheaper gas and other economic benefits. And like you said, we may see them take a softer stance on populism and the right wing and other illiberal forces in Europe, such as those countries you listed. And as much as a victory this could be for America, this could very easily go in the other direction and drive a wedge between the Anglosphere and continental Europe.
Yeah, and that's what I'm seeing the potential of. There were certain people thinking, I guess, way back in 2007, 2008, 2009, um, that were sort of there was some British thinkers who were talking about Britain and Europe going in a third direction from both Russia and from America, and in particular Britain managing that. But that's not likely. I think Britain will become more subservient to America going forward.
Oh yeah, and I don't even see it as a subservience. I mean, as LARPy as it sounds, it's a brother people. It's an Anglo-dominated country across the Atlantic, really reconciling with their homeland. Which I mean, the reconciliation happened a few decades after the American Revolution. But point being is, it's sort of coming full circle to the point where we're completely integrated with each other again. Now, I think it'll take a long, long time for complete American-British integration, but we've seen it throughout the 20th century and throughout the 21st century, especially with American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other American military adventurism and anti-Rush policy. The UK has been the first one to stand by our side in those sort of things. Even though they stayed in the Iran deal after we did, they were kind of the dissenting voice out of the other major powers remaining. So, point being is, for the past, I would say, since World War One, the Americans, the British, have acted as one unit on the world stage. Aside from like small things like the Suez Crisis, maybe the early days of the Falkland Wars, these countries have been completely integrated on a geopolitical level.
Yeah, they have. I just don't think the British population isn't as delighted about this, and I don't think Brexit will deliver what Brexiters had hoped, and Brexit may produce something that Remainers had warned about. Um, Especially if Trump gets reelected. Although I acknowledge, the British have always been there, during the 20th century and going into the 21st for, America's geopolitical hegemony or adventurism or whatnot. Uh, the truth is, it's never had it. The Brits are not as enthusiastic about uh, American hegemony as Americans are. It, like on some level, it's still there's still a there's still a vassalship, and Brits are honest about that. Uh, Brits do want more independence, but Brexit isn't going to deliver this independence for them.
And I believe we remarked on this several months back, maybe over a year ago, that it is still very strong in the British mentality, especially among British boomers, that they are the British Empire and they are the preeminent power in the world. That mindset has not died down, considering the fact they've released most of their colonies and they've become, I believe, the world's seventh foremost power in military, somewhere around that. But I don't think a lot of older Brits, which makes up the political class, have realized that their time is over fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think the next few years will demonstrate that.
Yeah, so what we could see is I don't see a far from a divorce from the UK and US, but I could see maybe not on the level of the political class, maybe a little bit among some elements, but I think probably the UK establishment will be very friendly and integrated with the United States political class. But I have a feeling in the population, you're going to see a lot of resentment as they start to realize they're a secondary power sort of under the wings of the United States, rather than what they
Right,
saw as an equal partnership, or maybe even earlier in the 20th century as them being the senior partner in that relationship.
right.
But that's all I have for Brexit. I got a couple other pieces of European news. So, despite what the media will tell you, the regional elections in Italy went pretty good. Now, Salvini's party, formerly Lega Nord, which means League of the North, a northern secession party, which later rebranded to Lega, made massive gains, at least the conservative coalition that includes FDI, that includes a few other right wing parties, in Calabria, which is the foremost southern region of Italy, right having that small sea canal with Sicily. Point being, it's one of the most southern parts of Italy if you're excluding the Sicilian island. And they had
Mhm.
a pretty healthy victory there. Now, Southern Italians have been more populistic, more on the anti-EU, more right-wing and liberal side, but that's no surprise. But the fact that they made that, I would say, alliance with a party that had previously disparaged them, I'm not saying Salvini in particular, but the party structure itself, that had disparaged Southern Italians and said, we're better off without your dead weight, they voted for a, maybe not that party in particular, but parties in alliance with a party that said that stuff even just 10 years ago. Uh, So we had that, and then I'm probably gonna butcher this, but the Emilia Romagna region, again, something like that. That one very northern region, which is a strong left wing province. The right wing coalition won about 44% in, and the media is painting that as this giant blow to populism, to the right wing movement in Europe, when this is the closest they've come in several years to winning. I mean, that's like a it's like a 11-point difference between the two.
Hmm.
I think it was something like that. I think it was like a 55-44, and then a few percents to like other third party coalitions, as it were. But point being, the fact that they made that much of a gain in a region that is been hostile to them for decades, ever since pretty much the beginning of modern Italian democracy, I think that says a lot. Now, of course, we'll see more regional elections as the years go on, and the government has still been shaken to the core. Now, they haven't stepped down yet, but their approval ratings, their ability to even govern, has been completely diminished. And I could be wrong, but I thought it was invalidated under Italian law. I didn't think they had a large enough coalition to maintain a government, but it could be, and it could be just because of political forces that are still being rigged in there by the establishment president. But point being is, one victory and one almost victory in a province that is heavily skewed against you, that's a blow of confidence to this government that deposed your party, deposed your coalition, and calls you all sorts of vile things, to the point where you're still making gains. Almost every regional election, you see the right wing coalition, one of these parties, make even more gains, stalking on the same rhetoric, the anti-migration rhetoric, close the ports, uh, get stand up to the EU, increase relations with outside powers, also reject liberalism at home beyond just the migration. Now, admittedly, these aren't exactly like they're not exactly the hard socially conservative right wing. Now, they're much closer to that than the left wing parties are in Europe, but point being is, it's a move towards rejection of liberalism on every front, whether that be economic liberalism with some economic proposals of the populists, with the incentivization of families, some of the land policies they have, some of the tax policies they have, whether that be, again, migration policy, foreign policy, relationship with the EU. Point being is, as much as they're going to try to construe this as, I mean, this happens every time uh, any of their parties or allies lose an election. You see this in Hungary when the mayor of Budapest became a member of the opposition party. When, again, we discussed that's actually typical in a lot of these countries. The capital city will be ruled by the opposition party, despite an overwhelming majority of the ruling party in the national government. You see this in Russia whenever there's one demonstration against Putin, where Navalny gets out there and uh, gives his speech about why St. Petersburg needs a pride parade or whatever. You see this in Poland whenever they push the pride parades in Poland. But point being is, no matter how many losses they paint these to be, it's quite the opposite. It's actually a hiccup in a trend going in a direction they're very unhappy about.
Right, and you could see that immediately after the election, European websites like Euronews and France 24 were saying major defeat for Salvini. Uh, I kid you not; those were its its headlines. Uh, but what was telling was that there weren't really that many stories that followed thereafter. So my guess the hope was that people would read the headline. They would be comforted that Mussolini lost. I'm sorry, Salvini, and that they could go on with their day, and that there were no follow ups and so on. So it was interesting. I noticed that, and it didn't last longer than 48 hours of ridiculous headlines. And at that, there weren't really that many.
Yeah, I mean, as little as Italian politics gets talked about in the Anglosphere, it. I mean, you go back to the old stereotype as Italy as the least of the Western powers, as it were, sort of the weakest link in there, which could explain some of their sympathies towards the East. I'm not saying that they're strong, but point being is, I mean, out of any country in Europe willing to cooperate with Russia, Italy is up there, as we've gone over
Mm.
time and time and time again. But point being is, they put so much more media attention in this country, whose internal politics they hardly pay attention to, except when they like to mock Berlusconi. I'm not saying there wasn't plenty there to mock, but point being is, the serious coverage they give this country, it's this narrative they can't even maintain for 3 days.
Yeah.
But ultimately, again, I'm not making any predictions because the way parliamentary governments work, it could be tomorrow, could be 3 months from now. Um, I still foresee a national election being called with a right wing coalition victory. Now, whether Salvini will be the prime minister, I'm sure he'll have some high position in the government. Maybe he won't be prime minister. Maybe he'll be deputy prime minister again, or interior minister, what he was also before. But point being, that's what stands. And one final point about Italy, unrelated to electoral news. I may have mentioned this earlier, but they were also one of the countries to suspend their flights. So even without Salvini in power, the Italian government, which is famous for its dysfunction, is still faster on closing its borders to a health crisis than the United States government, with someone who's such a hardliner as Trump. But with that out of the way,
Yeah.
pretty interesting news out of Italy. Pretty interesting how they can't even keep this narrative up. And honestly, the fact that they even tried to, I think, is a good sign for people like us.
Well, the reason that Trump didn't was hesitant on a ban was he wanted to save the Uyghurs, as
Oh, of
far as I
course.
know.
Uh, I heard it was that great new trade deal, which you'll notice, not to get on too far of a tangent since I have more relevant news. The Hong Kong protests really died down once Phase 1 of the trade deal was signed. Pretty interesting how that
Yeah,
works.
yeah, I noticed the same thing, and that's well before the coronavirus.
Hmm.
But that died down pretty fast. And but the other news in relation to the coronavirus in Hong Kong is Hong Kong was building a quarantine sort of makeshift hospital, and the protesters burned it down. Like, honestly, they're insane.
Yeah, it's something else. But like I said, Putin poisoned the Chinese population to distract from impeachment, which we may or may not get into. But in more relevant news, let's get a little bit into Syria. Now, there's been some actual gains by Assad's government. Let me just pull up the map, and uh, I believe the headline said Assad's forces smashed their jihadist lines. And of course, that's a sensationalized headline. But point being, this is the most gain we've seen by his forces in Idlib for quite some time. We were sort of talking about how Idlib had become a stalemate for quite some
Yeah,
time. And that's also with the news of the attack of an offshore pipeline by rebel forces near northwestern Syria. Now, of course, some of these rebels are still under Western CIA, MI6, various intelligence agencies' directions. I doubt with this specific one with the pipeline, especially, that they were under Turkish direction. That doesn't seem to make much sense. Or they could have just been a group that, hey, maybe trained and funded by Turkey, but went rogue and attacked their pipeline as retribution for not assisting them enough in this war. But point being is, yeah, I know we say this every episode, but things are actually picking up in Idlib this time. And again, this can only go on so long. And with the fact that we've seen major gains, I mean, every time we pull up this map, there's always a cluster of little events around Idlib. And
yeah,
these one, the Idlib province, not just the city, but these ones were in southwest Aleppo in particular. Now, as secure as Aleppo has been, as much as life has returned to normal, you still get these occasional jihadist attacks on the city. I mean, you can see it right there. It's right on the border of Syrian government-controlled territory and opposition-controlled forces in the green. So that'll happen every once in a while. They'll get shelled, a market will get blown up, a suicide bomber will come in, whatever. But that's been another place there's been a stalemate now, much less than the outskirts of Idlib and the other cities within the province. But point being is, this is still a major victory, no less, considering the fact that ever since, yeah, some of the tanker wars and the oil shortages in Syria, they've been a real pain in the ass in Aleppo, in these other areas right on the border region. And especially with the way these sort of groups operate, we've seen this even in American strategy. Now, don't get me wrong, the American wars in the Middle East have mostly been a disaster, but not when it comes to fighting these groups, but when it comes to maintaining law and order and rebuilding the societies, which naturally the Syrian government, being Syrian, is much better at than a foreign power doing it. But these groups, if you can strike a blow on one, a lot of them will scatter and disperse and reorganize later. But point being is, if you can strike blows at some of them, it'll sort of scare the rest into fleeing and reorganizing, which gives you an advantage. And that's how these sort of wars are fought. So, with a major blow like this, we'll probably see some of these groups, maybe not even the ones near Aleppo, but in the province in general, scurry further inland. And I think that's the way this sort of battle has to be won. This sort of campaign has to be waged. Now, of course, here I am playing armchair general, having never commanded an army that wasn't on a computer screen. But point being, from my knowledge of these sort of things, now somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, offer more clarification in the comments in the live chat, whatever. But that's my take on it, at least.
Right. I found it interesting that prior to these enormous advances, and they are really, given how long they've been fighting in Idlib, these are enormous advances. We're talking about the M5 highway, a huge chunk of it from south of where it meets the M4 highway now is in Syrian hands. If you look at the map, it looks like, if Syria is not careful, as long as swath as this is, if Syria is not careful, there could be a pincer movement. But honestly, the forces are melting away. At least 200 dead, and that's according to the forces fighting against Assad. The number could be even higher, for all we know. But basically, what I wanted to say, that was prior to these advances, it really looked like the Idlib forces, the militant forces, were going to make a break, and they were going to push back Assad once and for all. They had a lot of success. They took out nearly a dozen tanks, armored car, BPRs, that sort of thing, trucks with missile launchers on them and whatnot, and dozens of dead Syrian soldiers. So but in retrospect, I look at that as kind of like a last attempt. Why? Because of the way things have gone just in the last 2-3 days. That attempt, the week prior and the week prior to that, to me shows not just like maybe bad organization, but even like they might be running out of ammunition.
Yeah, this looks like a last-ditch effort sort of attack where they're digging in, they're giving everything they got, they're dying before accepting the shame of surrender or capture. And I think that's probably a good way to look at it when it comes to tallying up the increased amount of deaths on the Syrian forces side. Because before, when there was still a fighting chance, they would just flee inland, they would scatter and reorganize. But they're getting to the point where they have less and less land to do that. Now, as I said before, it comes with striking them and trying to get them to scatter and regroup. And eventually, it does get to this point where they're eventually going to dig in and give their final stand. But I think the approach has to be two-pronged, which we're seeing between Russia and Turkey, to the point where, yes, these groups are backed by Turkey. Turkey plays a large role in what's happening in Idlib right now, to the point where Syria can keep on smashing these forces all day. They may admittedly be running low in supplies, but if Turkey decides to be generous or decides to pump a little bit more into it, that can reinvigorate the war effort. Which means they can keep on doing this all day, but at least from my estimation, Turkey, if they get too concerned, they'll just send more arms, more supplies, to the point where, and as I said, it's been going on for 2 years now, but a diplomatic solution has to be reached in between the powers, the outside powers in the war, in order for Idlib to finally fall. And like I said, that may involve a deal in northern Syria with this little breakaway section with Turkish forces there. You can even see with some of the blue dots near Idlib, there's been some Turkish casualties, some Turkish involvement in that. But again, it
Yeah.
goes back to the point where I think it can be done without a deal. It's just going to be much more of an uphill battle. And I do expect a deal at some point. We've seen murmurings, we've seen more attention on Libya lately, but I have a feeling when you get those meetings between Putin, Erdogan, or any of these summits with the European powers, Russia and Turkey, that Syria is most definitely on the agenda, even if not the main topic.
Right, and I just wanted to follow up. I don't mean like the forces were literally losing ammunition and they were going to use the last bit of it. It does have that appearance. Uh, it's I think what they're slowly realizing is the support isn't there.
Yeah,
Uh, no one is coming to the rescue now. Turkey has sent a convoy of about 30 vehicles. Some of which are offensive militarily speaking, and they have parked basically at that corner where the M5 and the M4 cross. Incidentally, it was shelled, but I'm hearing conflicting reports about whether one of the vehicles was taken out, or and the number of casualties. One side says there wasn't. The other side says there is. However, that's really losing sight for the forest by paying too much attention to the trees, and that is that Turkey really hasn't been there. Like, Turkey seems very invested in the north, where the Kurds are. Um, this is where the Syrian army has engaged Turkish-backed militants. And we should also mention that Turkey now has moved approximately 3,000 fighters to Libya. And that very well may have been what had forced the militants in Idlib to go for an all-out attack, as it were, as if they had lost all their ammunition, is because they're literally losing their fighters. Not that there was always great coordination, even from the onset of the war. There were rivalries and bickering and even hostilities between some of these militant factions, between those backed by Al Qaeda, those backed by ISIS. On top of that, you had soldiers switching sides and so on. And so, yeah, Idlib, I think is going to continue to get smaller. The one last domain now is on the west side of the M5. There are some mountains. They're more like really large hills than outright mountains, the way we would think of, say, the Rockies or even the Appalachians. Nonetheless, for such flat country, they do offer a very good vantage point, and they will not be easy. But loss of support is fading. Of all the northern cities, the one that they captured is the second largest. It's the next largest after Aleppo, and and the Syrian army did not find an incredible amount of resistance other than mines being left behind, which is essentially just a delayed tactic. So, yes, Idlib is advancing, and that little green patch of militant control is getting smaller.
yeah. Every week when I check the map, even if I don't put it up on the screen, there's more and more dots, regardless of color, near Idlib. It just every week it keeps on shrinking and shrinking. Northern
Yeah.
Syria is stabilized with the Turkish operations there. Um, there was, of course, that standoff between U.S. and Russian forces last week, but point being is things in Syria are, I mean, of course, given the circumstances, wrapping up. I'm much faster than I think anyone would have expected, but I think we should move on to the final topic of the show, which is the deal of the century, given to us by none other than President Jared Kushner. So there's your map right there. It may be a bit hard for you to see on the screen, but this is pretty much the same proposal, just one told from the Israeli point of view, one told from the Palestinian point of view. Of course, these blue dots represent what would be the new Palestinian state. And it's completely disparate, it's completely scattered because the settlements Israel has built in the West Bank have been recognized under the deal, has been considered part of the uh, Israeli territory in agreement to form Palestinian state. So what their proposal is, they want to give them this scattered land around the West Bank with, and somebody actually had an interesting picture. I don't have it on me, but they blanked out Israel and just showed it, and it looked like an archipelago, it looked like a group of islands. And to connect it to Gaza and these other territories that are going to get in the Negev desert along the Egyptian border, they want them to build, wait for it, an underground tunnel. Palestinians, famous for their
Of
underground
all the
tunnel.
preposterous things.
Yeah, it's like we gotta watch out for Hamas and their tunnels, which is why we're gonna give you a tunnel connecting the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah. Believe me, we know a lot about tunnels.
It's wild. It is something. But
Blumf is going to have to make the best tunnels.
Frankly, the best. Yeah.
I mean, go ahead.
You thought the Trump train was just a figure of speech. No, it's that train that runs underneath Israel. But this is the peace plan, of course. Surprisingly enough, Putin gave tepid support for it, which I think at this point, probably because there was a larger concession on Syria involved in there, which that hasn't been revealed. But when it comes to Putin and Netanyahu, if there's an agreement on Israel and Palestine, it's usually because there's some concession or agreement on the topic of Syria and or Iran. But this did not go over well with the Palestinian leadership or the Palestinian people. They rejected outright, which, frankly, looking at this proposal, I can't really blame them. This was designed by Kushner and Netanyahu and the Likud party, and that's part of the reason why Trump had both Netanyahu and Benny Gantz at the White House at the same time, getting both their approval for the plan because Israel can't decide on prime minister apparently, which I wouldn't be surprised if another election gets forced. And I mean, are they just going to keep on having elections? This is getting up to Italy levels of dysfunctional democracy. But
yeah,
I mean, just looking at this map, it looks. Look, number one, my thoughts on this is I don't see why we're so heavily involved in defining the borders of a new state and trying to solve this border dispute. My thoughts are clearly, look, I have my personal feelings towards Israel, but ultimately, it's very little, if at all, our business what they do with their neighbors, what they do with the Palestinian population. Now, again, I may have my own personal sympathies, but from a realistic standpoint, from a standpoint of geopolitical interests, I could not care less. And it frustrates me that we're so involved in this peace deal. Now, I understand the external forces. I'm not saying we could just pack up and leave tomorrow, but just putting that out there. But point being is, this offer is an insult from a Palestinian point of view. I mean, if, say, they would even agree to withdraw from the settlements and give them an actual solid piece of land on the West Bank, and maybe even leave the Jordan Valley, which of course that was one of the big ones that they were saying, oh, Israel must maintain control of the Jordan Valley for XYZ reasons. And if they rejected that, I think that would be a bit ridiculous and pedantic on the Palestinian part, even though I would have some understanding. But the fact that they were thrown this, I do not blame them at all for rejecting whatever this is. And I'm surprised with some of the stuff that's been coming out about Israel's nuclear program and just Israel's blunders in general, that the Palestinians, I'm not saying, of course, they would have had any diplomatic leverage in the first place, but I'm surprised they didn't have ever so slightly more diplomatic leverage with, again, just some of the absolute blunders Israel has been making lately. But I suppose that goes to show the way Israel is just able to weasel out of things, especially when it comes to its relationship with the United States, and to an extent, the Western world, and to, I would say, a lesser extent, but still there, Russia.
Right. I mean, it's not a deal at all. This is just simply protecting the status quo. There's only a 4-year term limit. I mean, Israel is only promising them, we won't continue to colonize you for 4 years. How about that?
How about that?
I mean, they have no right to a military. Can you name any state on the planet that's an actual state and doesn't have a military?
Kosovo.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay, Okay, you got me. um, okay, but that's not a NATO base. Anyhow. Uh, so, yes. I mean, I think it's tragic. If you look at the map, these territories far flung that are supposed to be connected with tunnels is ridiculous. Uh, didn't Israel spend decades complaining about tunnels funneling arms, from Egypt into the Gaza Strip and so on? I mean, I think Israel hung on to this till the world became um, disenchanted with the whole thing. Uh, we talk about trends, and the trend where this is going. I think Israel and Kushner, especially, are very well aware of the kind of consent that they've manufactured in America and in the West, and that's really the only partner to Israel that matters. The others are just incidental. Russia doesn't donate $3.5 billion a year to Israel and won't. The more that Israel becomes an ethno state, the less so for America and the West. So, draw your parallels. But I think the world has given up, and at this point, all the Turning Point USA, the Ben Shapiros, and all the other right-wing grifters have helped manufacture this consent to a great degree. I think the left wing still fundamentally cares about the Palestinians, but they can't achieve anything, and they haven't been able to.
Yeah, their caroling goes as far as they view Israel as a Western colonialist state, and they view these people as poor, oppressed people. Which I'm not saying the Palestinians aren't oppressed. I'm not saying that they don't have a raw deal in front of them, quite literally in this case. But I doubt left wingers have much sympathies with the Palestinians as a people or a culture or a actual group. And it again, not to borrow the establishment right wing talking point, but I'm sure if many of them went to the Palestinian territories or had to live in a Palestinian community, they probably wouldn't like it that much. It's not exactly like some cultural or spiritual connection they have, which admittedly, some of the like Zionist evangelicals, as misguided as it may be, they actually do have that with Israel and Jewish culture. But the point stands.
Oh, to be honest, I think American evangelicals are more delusional about Jews than they are about Palestinians.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, they're obsessed with their eschatology. 100-year eschatology that literally has never had a precedent in Christendom prior. But I would push back a little bit. I when I was on Google Plus and several other media platforms way back, I think the support for Israel was not just on the left, but I think it was a pretty broad spectrum, and I do think it was genuine. I'm just saying that those groups don't have any power. They can't achieve anything. That's not where the power lies. The only way anything can turn around is if America decides it should, and America can't decide that.
Yeah, I'm completely agreeing with that. And just to finish this out, I figured this would have gone on longer, but there's not much to say about this joke of a deal, as it were. That it is amazing, even in the past 2-3 years, to watch support for Israel, even amongst a lot of right wingers, people who were very Zionistic, very pro Israel, completely evaporate. Now, a lot of these people aren't saying, like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that kind of sort of stuff. Even I don't say that. My official position is I don't really care either way. It's not our problem, not the problem of European people, not trying to get in the pan European thing, but it's not the problem of the parts of the world I care about. Is my point. And
Yeah, I mean, I just think the marker. I just think the worse it gets for Palestine, the worse it will get for us.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree that
I don't think that's. I'm not saying one is causal for the other, but I think they're related, and I don't think anyone can. None of us can argue the last 70 years that this has been the trend.
yeah, I would definitely agree insofar as bellwether. But my point, going back to that, is yeah, even amongst the right, even amongst people who were very much pro-Israel during the 2016, maybe even a little bit after, it's completely evaporated. Now, whether that be because of some of their operations in Syria becoming more exposed, maybe that may be because they've been a lot more overt about trying to drive the United States into confrontation with Iran, due to many factors, some of the espionage stories that have come out, and just more general awareness. I mean, as much as a meme it is now, but stuff like the U.S.'s Liberty, people looking into the history of espionage, and really, despite what the friendly face on the surface, the very contentious relationship between Israel and Western countries, the United States in particular, a lot of people have woken up to that over the past few years. I'm not even saying they're getting onto the sort of JQ stuff. I'm saying they're just realizing maybe we don't have much in common with this country on a social or political level as we previously thought. And maybe they aren't necessarily a natural ally for us in the region. And maybe, honestly, they're an anchor around our neck and more of our greatest burden than our greatest ally.
Hmm.
Uh, that I mean, yeah, I've talked to several people, like both personally and online in different debates, and I've seen people I watch on YouTube and follow on social media, really, again, like I said, not turn anti-Israel, but sort of turn to, well, who cares? Why is it our problem? Whereas these people would have been saying we must stand with Israel, for example, in the 2014 Israel-Gaza war that happened. They would have been completely pro-Israel on Israel's side. They must go and smash Hamas, whatever. But like I said, over time, it seems not a hostility, but a general indifference, and maybe I would say a most an annoyance among some people. A lot of people are wondering, okay, why are we talking about this so much? What's the point of this? Why is this country in the Middle East so damn important?
Right. I mean, if Trump is reelected, I'm wondering how long it will uh, how long it will take for Jonathan Pollard to be released. I mean that to me seems the next step.
I wouldn't be surprised at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if, maybe, of course, Trump has been very cooperative, unfortunately, over, I would say, 2019 2020. Again, I think what bit of fight Trump had left died after the 2018 midterms, but that's aside the point. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, maybe not Trump, but some other administration sometime down the road may release figures like Pollard or there's a few other high-profile ones that we still have locked up and have under some penalty. I wouldn't be surprised if that. I mean, again, they've been lobbying to get these people pardoned or get their sentence commuted for years now, and I know Russia recently commuted or pardoned the sentence of in I believe it was an Israeli woman they had in prison. So, uh,
Yeah,
I mean, and
she had a joint. She was caught with a joint in her luggage. Uh, Pollard, of course, gave valuable military and intelligence secrets to Israel uh, while he was working for as a intelligence analyst for the
that it
U.S.
was like 19. I think
87.
yeah, yeah, 87. Is that when they caught him?
I think it was around there. Israel didn't admit that they were paying him to do this until 1998.
Yeah, something like that. But I mean, that puts in the perspective of, yeah, that ties in the Cold War. A lot of this technology was going to the Soviet Union, and China, that they were stealing from us. And he was a naval intelligence officer, of course, going back to the land power versus sea power debate, which has been raging for centuries now. I mean, you're giving the Soviet Union, which at the time actually did have the capability to truly harm the United States, a country that could properly be considered a rival as compared to some of these faux rivalries we have today, giving them the secrets to our largest advantage over them. That's like them stealing like tank designs from the Russians. I know Russian tanks are more quantity than quality than anything, but or for okay, better example, Russian missile designs in the United States. That's as much as a breach as it was to us. As just put things in perspective, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these things start happening. I mean, if they can put that kind of pressure on Russia, which we, admittedly said, yeah, there's influence there, but much less. I wouldn't be surprised if they keep on playing their cards. And I think the reason they're playing a lot of these cards is because they're realizing, especially with the demographics of the United States, whether that be age demographic, racial, religious, that they're in the last decade or so where they can really start doing these things. So might as well get as much out of it you can before Brazil 2.0 comes around.
Yeah, I mean, this is so. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything other than that to add.
Well, I think we did pretty well for ourselves today. We covered all the big stories. Iowa elections, Iowa caucuses, of course, are on Monday, so we'll have news about that next week. Going in, I would say it's looking neck and neck between Biden and Bernie. In my prediction, it's gonna be one of those two. Even though with the way the caucuses work out, Bernie might pull it off. Just a shot in the dark sort of prediction. I'm not going to get into any of the polling and analysis, but yeah, just to end the show. I'm looking forward to some of the stuff happening with the primaries. Of course, impeachment's going to be there, and one thing I'll tell you about impeachment, that's going to require Warren and Sanders to be in the Senate, which you would think would benefit Biden. But it turns out the Senate Republicans have the vote to call Biden as a witness to testify in the impeachment trial. So we could see someone like a Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I don't know why. I suppose like gay Frenchman. It sort of fits him. I know he isn't French. I know he's like Maltese or something, but it works at least in my mind. But yeah, this could be something that gives him a boost. So the point being is, you're most likely going to have your most uh, three prominent Democrats involved in this impeachment debacle while the primaries are going on. So that's definitely going to be interesting. We'll probably get into that and more election news next week. But I'm sure there'll be more news about Syria, more news about this virus. Of course, European news never stops. Probably some stuff about Russia. Again, probably looking forward to the usual fare next week. But this has been the War Report. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Goodbye.